The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ILSoy Advisor webinar, Creating a System for Soybean Yield Success, brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I'm Jill Seiler, and I will be moderating the webinar today. A few housekeeping items to start with. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar, and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will be automatically submitted for one CEU in crop management. If you are listening to a recording of this webinar, you'll need to go to the Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and apply for a self-study credit. You can ask questions during the webinar by submitting them using the dashboard on the right side of the screen. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. Please keep your questions brief and to one point. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, AJ Woodyard. AJ is a technical crop production specialist with BASF. In this role, he works with top growers and industry representatives from across the U.S., researching ways to maximize corn and soybean yields. An East Central Illinois native, AJ holds a bachelor's degree in crop science and a master's in weed science, both from the University of Illinois. I'll hand it over to you now, AJ, to begin.
All right, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you for the opportunity to join all of you today on what's a pretty nice Friday morning here. I'm just outside of Champaign, Illinois at our BASF Midwest Research Farm. So I've got a lot of content to cover, I'm not going to lie, and I'm going to try to force a lot into a short period of time. So I hope that as we go through this material, it gives you a chance to maybe think a little bit differently about soybeans, and maybe gives you a few tips of things to go out and try and look at differently for the 2019 growing season as it shapes up here over the next few months. So with that, I just thought I'd open up maybe with a little bit of my philosophy towards soybean research. I do have the opportunity to work at a beautiful research farm where we get the chance to do a true replicated, good science-based research. And so there's a couple different things and approaches that I'm going to take as I go through this material. One, I'm going to deliver some things that have come from our research and my research background and the learnings that we've had from that. I also try to always bring some personal successes and failures from my own experiences growing up on a farm. So I was born and raised on a farm down around Paris, Illinois, and am still fortunate to be able to be involved in that operation too. So I hope that I always bring the perspective of not only the research side, but also the practical real world. We got to spend the money and make money back to make these decisions. And I always try to stress when I give presentations that what I'm attempting to do here is to give you the background info to go try some things in your own geography. And I will be the first to admit that just because something does or does not work for me doesn't mean you won't have a different result. But I'm going to challenge those in the audience today to be willing to go try some different things and learn what system for soybeans will work best in your particular geography. I just thought I'd throw this up here. This was recently published through the University of Illinois, and it really highlights some of the changes we're seeing in soybean production over the past 6 years. So this is actually highlighting by state the yields above trend line from 2013 through 2018. And if you look at this, there are several states that pop out at you, and I'm proud that Illinois is one of those, where we've been at about a 6.5 bushel yield above trend line during that period of time. So I think this highlights a few things. One, undoubtedly in this period, we've seen more devotion to management of soybeans, less of a thought of it's just a rotational crop. You also see some of these states that I would consider have been willing to adapt to high yield practices faster. And I think Illinois is a good highlight of one that's really jumped on certain practices that have helped promote and push yields, but beyond where we've been in previous years. So just again, kind of highlighting the exceptional yields we've seen versus trend line in the past 6 years. So as I kind of take a step back and just look at what I'm going to try to cover, there are a handful of things I'm going to be able to cover in the presentation today, and a few things that I won't be able to get to. So I wanted to summarize in one slide my thoughts on the things you need to do to put yourself in a position to be successful with soybean management. And so these are the 8 things that I'll typically look at and say, all right, if I'm going to look at trying to raise my whole farm average, these are probably the first areas that I'm going to focus to attempt to be able to accomplish that, while also looking for opportunities to manage costs, as I know that's something that we have to be thinking about in the current marketing environment as well. So, as I look at this, this isn't necessarily ranked by certain value. These are just the practices that I believe year in and year out you need to have right. And that would include planting dates, row spacing, not only good variety selection, but also thinking about your maturity group selection based on your planting dates. We're adjusting and thinking about seeding rates, plant nutrition, and I won't have a lot of time to cover this, but I think this is a critical part that we put a lot of research focus on recently to better understand that and know that plant nutrition is important to raise high yield soybeans. Seed treatments and inoculants, I think these are critical for any sort of earlier planting scenario. These are technologies that allow us to do that. Residual herbicides, especially as we push the envelope on planting dates, residual herbicides become that much more important, and we can't grow high yields if we've got weeds. And then finally, I'll touch on some things that we can try to do in season to influence the yield components and potential yield on our soybean crop. That would include something like Preacts or fungicide, fast-act insecticide for late season management. So these will be some of the things that we'll try to cover today. If you take nothing else away, one of the most important things for me in my presentation is this slide right here. It's really critical to understand the importance of light harvesting with soybeans. And when I look at it with a bean crop, I can't sit here today and tell you how many pods per plant we will have on a soybean crop in 2019. However, I can tell you with a lot of confidence that we'll likely see in every field that flowers and pods will be aborted through the growing season. And so when I look at soybeans, I tend to think of them as a source limited crop. We have to do what we can to intercept as much light through the growing season as possible, and also think about light interception during critical growth stages for soybeans to really be maximizing that light interception. And so one of the focuses I've had in our work is trying to get those beans to the R1 to R3 growth stages by the summer solstice, by June 21st. And geographically, depending on where you're listening in from today, that you're probably have the potential to maybe get to R1, and maybe in some other areas you can get to early R3 by that time frame. But those are the things that we're really thinking about in regards to managing for more yield and trying to reduce the amount of flower and pod loss we have in this crop. So just a high level, if we look at the things we need to do to get more soybean yield, there's really 3 ways that we can influence this yield equation. We either need more pods per acre, more seeds per pod, or more weight per seed. And as I look at our research program, we really try to understand, if we put in a new practice, how does it influence these 3 factors? And we'd love to find practices that influence all 3, but I'll tell you that's very difficult to find. So even if we can identify a practice that influences 2 or even 1 of these yield components, it's probably going to be something we want to include long term. And so I'll try to share a few thoughts on some of the practices we've looked at and how they've influenced this yield equation. So if I look at building a system for yield foundationally, everybody always wants the silver bullet. What's the one thing I can do to get more yield? I'll stress to you that it's a system. There's no doubt. You can't predict year in and year out what's going to be your biggest contributing factor to yield. So you've got to look at how do I put myself in the best position to be successful each year. With that being said, I will tell you that planting date probably has been, year in and year out, the biggest way to set that foundation for higher yields. I always kind of try to go through this discussion by talking about what I thought I knew. And in regards to planting dates, as recent as probably 3 years ago, what I thought I knew was that if we did not have soil temperatures above 50 degrees in the first 24 hours, we likely didn't want to be planting soybeans. So at that time, 2014, 2015, if a grower was looking at planting beans earlier, we were trying to identify when was that window going to be where we'd get soil temps above 50 degrees, at least in the first 24 hours. the reason we initially thought that was soybeans are in the imbibitional phase in the first 24 hours. That means they're going to drink water, whether it's 40 degrees or 60 degrees. And the risk is chilling injury and stand loss with extremely cold temperatures. After the first 24 hours, beans go into the osmotic phase, where chilling injury is much less of a concern. Now, with all this being said, I can tell you that if you're going to plant beans early in Illinois or in many of the other Midwestern states, there's probably going to be instances where temperatures will be below 50 degrees in the first 24 hours. So this was an area of research focus for us that we really needed to better understand. And I'll share a few of our experiences on that here in a bit. Probably one of the other big takeaways from our experience was this slide right here, which, again, what I thought I knew about soybeans was that they were completely photoperiod dependent, being that as you got past the longest day of the year, past June 21st, soybeans would begin to flower based on their maturity groups, and earlier maturity groups going first. So our assumption was, if that was 100% true, that if we planted earlier, so if we planted, say, mid-April, our likelihood was to increase the total number of vegetative growth days. We figured that we'd still flower after we got to June 21st, so we would just increase the number of days we spent in vegetative growth. We have put out trials where we've looked at growth staging daily across multiple varieties and in different planting dates. And so that's what you're looking at in this slide right here. And on the you've got basically across that x-axis all of the different growth stages of soybeans, from vegetative through each of the reproductive stages, and the number of days spent in those stages by planting date. The surprise to us was that far left-hand side, the vegetative growth days. It really didn't matter whether we were in that orange bar in our April planting dates or the green bar, which was May 22nd. We spent the same number of days in vegetative growth, which meant that by planting earlier, we could actually get flowering happening potentially ahead of the summer solstice. So now we have the opportunity to have our beans setting flowers during our longest days of the year. If you look at what earlier planting gained us in regards to certain growth stages and more days spent there, what we typically have seen is more days gathered in the early reproductive stages. And so I circled R2 here, and essentially by spending more days in these early reproductive stages, it allows the soybean plant to put on more nodes per plant. So more nodes per plant is a direct influence on that first yield factor of total pods per acre. And if we can have more nodes, we've got more potential to have increased pods per acre. Again, putting ourselves in a position to be successful. So this was a really key takeaway in our research that we've continually been able to duplicate over years, is the ability to get that flowering happening prior to the summer solstice and having those critical stages occurring during our longest days of the year. If we look at 2018, so I've kind of given you maybe a little bit of background info, and now I want to focus a little bit on what we learned in the 2018 growing season. And this was probably one of the most unique years for me in the years I've been doing research, in that the month of April was exceptionally cold. And so for a long period of April, it didn't look like we'd even have a chance to get any beans planted, which we know is critical for putting ourselves in a position to maximize yield. So this chart actually shows the ranking of each state in the U.S. in regards to the average temperatures in April from the period of 1895 through 2018. So the lower the number, the colder it was, obviously. And Illinois was the second record coldest April in that 124-year period, with Iowa and Wisconsin being the record coldest. So you see that it was extremely cold in the month of April, which didn't necessarily get us off to a roaring start this year. With that being said, we did have the opportunity, and have had the opportunity for several years in a row, to push some ultra early planting dates. And we've done this, I think, somewhat for the scientific side of things, of trying to understand how far can we push the envelope with soybeans. But it's given us some really good data and really good experiences. and it really helped us understand the kind of stresses that soybeans maybe are able to tolerate with today's technology. So we planted on 2 different dates in March. We had March 16th, that was a stale seed bed that had been leveled in the fall that we planted straight into. It was extremely cold that day. I had put soil thermometers in the ground, and we were about 28 degrees at 2 inches at the time we started planting. So pretty far below that 50-degree threshold. We also had a March 22nd planting date where we came in and clean tilled it right ahead of planting. We planted multiple seeding rates, multiple varieties, and multiple row spacings at that time. So we had 2 different options and potential options to look at some March planting dates again here in 2018, as well as several other planting dates through the year. After we planted those beans, we had probably the most extreme conditions I've ever seen after planting some very early beans. It snowed on Easter Sunday at our location, and it snowed some accumulation for the next 4 Sundays in a row. And for a long period of time, we had frozen soil conditions that those beans were sitting in. So it didn't look like there was much potential for success with that March planting date in the 2019 season. With that being said, you can look at this info here on this chart, and this is essentially what we ended up with our different planting dates with multiple varieties. So at each of these planting dates, we had 4 varieties planted in 2 different seeding rates and 2 different row spacings. And I've got that March 22nd date coded in red, because if you look at the stats, everything would have told you you should not be planting, obviously, in the month of March and on those days. But the 24-hour soil temperature was about 34.8 degrees. The 7-day temperature was 41.7, so well below 50 degrees for the first 7 days. The number of days from planting to emergence was 40. So it took 40 days for those beans to go from planting to emergence, the longest period of time we'd ever had for any of our March planting dates. And we still ended up at about 64% final stand versus target in our seeding rates. So more than enough plants to take that all the way to yield. The interesting thing, if you look at the rest of these planting dates, we had a couple dates in late April. Both of those planting dates, the beans were up essentially within 10 days, which was a rare occurrence. And normally it would take longer, even at our location, for beans planted at that time of the year to emerge. But we had exceptionally warm temperatures in the early part of May that changed the game. So again, a very unique growing season as you look at these stats. Everything changed in the month of May. So if I pop up April right next to May, you look at May of 2018, and it was the warmest May on record for many states in the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio included. So 124 years, the record warmest. And this put us in a completely different situation for the rest of the growing season. One of the things that we try to look at with our planting date studies is a couple of different ways of looking at this data. So again, I've averaged all 4 maturity groups. This represents everything from a 2.9 to a 4.0 in this research. And we've got basically on the top of these bars, I've got the number of days from emergence to maturity. So not the planting date, but the days those beans emerged till the day they reach maturity. And you see a pretty rapid drop off in total number of days those beans are out in the field. I've also got this broken out by total heat unit accumulation. So in the bars, that shows the total number of GDUs those beans accumulated through the year. And I often get the question of, yeah, you might extend total days, but do you extend the total amount of heat or total amount of GDUs that are accumulated through the year? And if you look here, you can see that, in fact, we do. At the max, we're somewhere around 3,300 GDUs accumulated. By mid-May, that number has dropped below 3,100. And by early June, that number is below 2,700 GDUs. So the interesting thing is that decrease is typically occurring in the reproductive stages. So we're maintaining vegetative GDUs and we're reducing it in reproductive, which is exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want to decrease our time spent in those flower pod set and seed fill stages. Here's what the yield looked like, averaged across all varieties and all row spacings. And again, even with the March planting date and the struggles that it had early in the year, it was just off of our maximum yield, which was set on our April 23rd planting date. But you can see here that our yields rapidly dropped off when we got out of the month of April. And there was actually about a 33 bushel difference, or about a 30 bushel difference, a 33% difference from top to bottom in the planting date research this year in an exceptionally high yield environment. If I look at just accumulating 3 years of data for us now, and I pull these 3 years of data because they're the 3 years we've been able to plant beans in March, and they're also the 3 years that we've had pretty high yield potential in our bean crop. And so if I look at how this breaks out, what we have now started to see is that pretty much up until about April 25th, we are in a situation where we're maximizing yield potential. So there's not a lot of yield loss occurring in that time frame. Once we get past April 25th, we see that pick up speed. So even into the latter part of the month of April, we're losing somewhere around 0.2 of a bushel a day. By the time we cross over into May 1st, that number goes to about 45 hundredths of a bushel a day. And so there's rapid yield decrease that begins to occur there. This is probably contrary to what we've historically thought with soybeans. However, my argument is in these higher yield environments, there's even more of a penalty to delayed planting. In corn, if I just compare that trend to what we see on the corn side, also data we've replicated from 2015 through 2018 at our site, it's very different with corn. We see a positive slope going into the early part of May. So yields are actually increasing into early May. Our best corn yields have been occurring from April 25th to May 5th timeframe. And my argument here is corn, you need uniform emergence to really maximize yield. Yes, you do see a yield decrease later in the year on corn. So our data shows about a half a bushel a day, again, as you get past that May 10th timeframe. However, if you look at economics, the dollar per acre penalty for being delayed into the middle or latter part of May is about doubled when you look at soybeans versus corn. So when I look at if you're going to be in marginal conditions that may impact emergence, you do not want to be in marginal conditions with corn. You don't want to have ununiform emergence because it takes the top end out in a hurry. On soybeans, uniformity of emergence maybe is slightly less important than corn, but the really important thing is maximizing total light interception. So you have to really balance that and think about it when you consider when and at what time you're going to plant each crop. So what's changed? Why has early planting been more successful? Why has this been something that's been widely adapted? I think some of it is just the trends in rainfall. Rainfall patterns are moving to more consistent rain in June and July, more inconsistency in August. So the quicker we can move those beans through the growth stages, the better off we are. I think also agronomic improvements have come into place. So both from a genetic side as well as all of the technology and seed treatments has really allowed us to push the envelope and feel more confident that we can put soybeans into conditions that maybe we would have thought were not possible previously. One of the things I'll stress is you really want to identify your risk factors in early planted beans. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One would be weed control. So if you are looking at or considering looking at planting some beans earlier, you will have a longer period of time you've got to control weeds. So you need to be aware of the fact that your programs may have to adjust based on the weed potential you've got out there or the weed pressure. The other thing that I would point out is sudden death syndrome. This is a pretty common occurrence in early planted beans. And I've got a picture here with a couple of my interns high-fiving each other out in a bean field that we did have a seed treatment to address sudden death, so Levo. And you can see that picture of that plot. These were extremely early planted beans where a fungicide insecticide seed treatment alone did not give us protection against sudden death. When we added Levo in for sudden death syndrome, it addressed that very well. So identifying your risk factors, if sudden death is one of those, make sure that you're using a technology like Levo that can help address that potential issue. So that would just be my advice to think about in this particular system. So if I just transition to maybe a few of the other important agronomic practices that we think about, beyond planting date, I want to touch a little bit on seeding rates, row spacing, and maturity group. That's where I kind of want to focus here in the next little section of our discussion. And probably one of the things that was a surprise to me, as I look back maybe 10 years ago, I would say most people would agree that our seeding rates were probably substantially higher than they are today. And it tended to be that we assumed, regardless of what planting date we were going out, we were probably putting out 160, 170, maybe even 180,000 plants per acre. And I always questioned, was that the right thing to do, or should we adjust based on planting dates? And again, the phenomenon of soybeans in an early planted scenario is that they will put on more nodes per plant. So one of the penalties of that is if you crowd too many plants in early, you'll get competition, plant-to-plant competition, that leads to spindly stems that have high risk for lodging. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges we've had in higher yield environments, has been lodging and the beans falling down and the yield loss that we've been incurring due to that. So in the earlier planting dates, we've actually gone to lower seeding rates. And I think we've seen yields maximized even with lower seeding rates, which is sometimes counterintuitive to what we might have historically thought. As we get later in the year, and I'll call that late mid-planting dates, say in the middle part of May, middle to latter part of May, the late planting dates being late May or early June, we're slowly increasing our seeding rates at that time because, again, the bean plant will put on fewer nodes per plant. So we try to make up for that by putting more plants out there, make up for the fewer nodes per individual plant. If we look at maturity groups, I'll flip up my strategy here. Our success in the early planting dates has allowed us to stretch our maturity groups maybe to the later end of normal. So not trying to stretch outside of what your range would be, but just moving more of your load of varieties into that later season area. And for us at our research site, that means we've been more in the 3.5 to 3.9 range rather than in the early group 3s. In the mid planting dates, we don't see much of a difference between our early and long season beans. So if we have a delayed planting scenario, let's say 2019 shapes up to where it's May 10th before we can roll a planter out. In that circumstance, we're going to start with our early season beans, because by the time we get to our later or finishing up planting, we actually want to be back to the long season beans to try to maximize vegetative growth. So that's sort of the dynamic we put into place for seeding rates as well as maturity groups to try to maximize our yield opportunity. I'll just show quickly, and I'm going to flip a lot of stuff up here to try to get through this relatively quickly, but this is some row spacing data and a population data by row spacing. So I've got a whole bunch of info here. We focus on two seeding rates, 128 and 155,000. I've got on the left-hand side, I've got 30-inch rows. On the right-hand side, 15-inch rows. Within each of the bars, we have the final stands. And you can see that really there's not a tremendous amount of difference in going from 128,000 planted to 155. Maybe in the later planting dates, the June planting dates, we see more of a benefit. However, in the early planting dates, if you look at the 15-inch rows planted in March, on the bottom right-hand side of that slide, the final stand was at 75,000, and it was still over an 80 bushel yield in 2017. So even with low stands, we still saw some exceptional yields. If we look at the row spacing data from that particular year, if I look at on average what we saw about a 3 bushel increase across all of our varieties and planting dates. When we broke this out by planting date, this is where it got really interesting. We found that even in our earliest planting dates, our 15-inch rows were performing better, or our narrow row configurations. And that was in the blue bar. The orange bar is the 30-inch rows. If you look out to May 18th, the fourth set of bars over there, the blue bar in that case was 76 bushel 15-inch rows. The April planting dates in 30s were right around 76 bushel. So we sacrificed some of our early planting benefits in the wider rows. I'm not going to say that's going to happen every single year, but this was something that we saw in 2017. And it's one of the reasons why I try to discourage guys from going back to 30-inch rows and still focusing on some sort of a narrow row configuration like a 15 or a 20 or even a twin row. In 2018, we had the same research and data out. And again, I'm going to flip a lot of slides up here and apologize for all the information. But I've got, again, the 30-inch rows and 15s on the left and right-hand side. I've got the final stands within each of the bars. And you'll notice, again, that there was a little bit more of a population response in this higher yield environment. But still, you know, it's borderline whether there's really an economic advantage. So even at final stands around 100,000, we had some 100+ bushel soybeans. So very high yields with stands that were, you know, around 100,000 final. So my bottom line here is seeding rates aren't going to be the place that you're going to find a lot of additional bushels. It's going to be something that really is pretty small or pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Row spacing, on the other hand, was big again in 2018 in our work. So for the second year in a row, we saw significant benefits to 15s across all planting dates and varieties. It was about a 7 bushel response. And if I broke it out by our planting dates again, early planting dates, we still saw more of a benefit to narrow rows. And I'm becoming more of a believer that light capture early in the year, the light capture around June 21st is just really important. The May 14th planting date in 15-inch rows yielded about 89 bushel. The April planting dates in 30-inch rows were right around 89 or 90 bushel. So again, we sort of sacrificed some of that benefit by being in wider rows. Not to mention the importance of weed control that you can get from narrow rows. So if I just kind of summarize what we've seen from a couple of years of doing this seeding rate work as well as row spacing, the seeding rate's about a 1.1 bushel increase from going to 128 to 155 across all planting dates and all varieties, and that includes the late planting dates. So again, probably not even economical at that point and not a lot of benefit to go into higher seeding rates. In row spacing, on the other hand, it's about 5 bushel across 2 years. So a significant number of bushels gained by the narrow rows. Another neat thing and tool that we use is a Canopy Analyzer. We call this our soybean selfie stick, and we use this to take photos from underneath the canopy, and it gives us not only a photograph but also gives us data on the amount of light being intercepted by the plant versus the amount of light that's hitting the ground. And so we take these photos at various times of the year. I'm going to give you a look at one data point for 2 different years. So I'm going to start here. What we've got up on the screen right now is the photos we took in 2017. We took these on June 21st, the longest day of the year. I've got the April 13th vertical column on the far left-hand side. That was the April 13th planting date. May 18th on the right side. And then in the horizontal columns, that's 15 and 30-inch rows. So you can probably see the difference in the pictures, but also if you look at the data points in the narrow rows planted early, we were at about 75% light capture on June 21st. You compare that to the bottom right-hand corner, the May 18th planting date in 30-inch rows, we were at about 12% light capture on June 21st. And the difference also was the top left-hand corner, those beans were in R2. The bottom right-hand corner, those beans were at the V3 or in the vegetative growth stages. So a lot of benefits there to that earlier planting and narrower rows. If you look at 2018, this is really, to me, a telltale sign of what happened in 2018. The April 23rd planting date was, you can see there, and also a May 14th. If you visually look at these pictures, you can already probably see there was more growth on the beans at this time of the year than there was in 2017. If we put the data points up there, you see that the narrow rows planted April 23rd were at 85% light capture. Really an amazing number. And it tells you what the month of May and the early part of June did for soybean development in 2018. It's the reason why you're going to see record yields in probably quite a few states in the US this year for beans, was this drive for rapid development. The bottom left right-hand corner, the May 14th planting date, was at 36% light capture and 30-inch rows. You compare that to the April 13th planting date and 30-inch rows in the previous year in 2017, which was at 40%. So the May planted beans in 2018 acted more like an April planted bean in a normal year. And the April planted beans, well, best analogy I can give is Sosa and McGuire hit a bunch of home runs in 1998, and then we found out they were cheating and on steroids. That's essentially what our April planted beans acted like in 2018. Not something we'll always be able to duplicate, but it was the benefit of this year. The other benefit is it drove flowering much earlier. So again, more heat early in the year drove some of the earliest flowering dates I've ever seen. We had late group 3 beans, so a 3.8 maturity group that was already flowering by June 1st in our earliest planting dates. So we saw that ability to intercept light around June 21st and be in those critical stages much earlier than we normally would be. From our maturity group data, just quickly highlight that we've seen the longer season beans performing earlier or better in the earlier planting dates. So that red bar would represent our group 3.5s through our group 4.0s. The lighter color bar would be our late group 3s to our early, or late group 2s to our early group 3s, excuse me. And so you see that red bar, there's a pretty significant benefit in the early planting dates to the longer season beans. In the May planting dates, a lot of that benefit goes away. But by the time we get later in the year, we're seeing more of a benefit in the June planting date to the longer season beans again. So that's kind of the breakdown of what we see for maturity groups. I'll just focus the last 5 or 10 minutes here on some things we can try to do late in the season, and then I'll open it up for questions. We look at trying to figure out how we can protect our yield components as well. So late in the season, the yield component that we're probably most interested in is weight per seed and trying to get as much weight on those beans as possible. So that's an area we certainly focus in. I try to give my interns character building opportunities every year. So one of their character building opportunities is we send them out to hand harvest and count yield on 60 plants in each of our variety by planting date studies. And we do this twice. We do it once in season, which is why you see the green plants in that picture, to try to get an idea of how our yields potentially are shaping up. We also do it after harvest and do a post-harvest measurement. And that's what you're seeing here in this picture, or in this data chart. You see that the total nodes per plant decreases. So we've talked about that. Later planting dates, you'll put on fewer nodes per plant. The seeds per pod does not move much. And we've looked at a lot of different practices. Seeds per pod is pretty stable. You don't see a lot of movement in that number. Changing planting dates, changing fertility, changing or using fungicides really doesn't affect that number a lot. So that's not one that we focus as much on, but seed weight definitely is an area that you can influence. If you look at critical nodes for soybean yield, nodes 5 through 16 are going to give you about 80 to 85% of your yield. So you really want to be focused on protecting the middle part of that soybean plant, because that's where a lot of the money is going to come from. This is a common site where stresses are left unmanaged. We drew a 1 square foot, 1 by 1 square foot on the ground underneath the canopy, found 11 viable pods plus a lot of other smaller pods laying on the ground in a situation where there was some heavy insect feeding as well as some disease that had set in. 11 viable pods on the ground is a lot of yield that's lost. Seed weight is something that doesn't take a lot to influence. A 2 milligram increase in seed weight gives you about a bushel increase in yield. So George Washington, the dollar bill, if you cut that into 1,000 pieces and I handed you 2 of them, that's about 2 milligrams. So that's how much weight you'd have to increase each seed to get a bushel of yield. It doesn't take a lot, but we've got to think about managing our stresses during grain fill. Don't give up on the crop too early, and then maintain photosynthetic activity as long as possible. If we can do those two things, we've got the potential to move seed weight in our favor, which is going to give us more yield. Wet environments and seed quality was a major issue this year. In 2018, the late harvest drove a lot of pathogen and insect challenges. So we saw everything from Phomopsis to frog eye leaf spot, pod and stem blight, purple seed stain, and a lot of stink bug feeding that opened up those pod walls and exposed them to some of the elements. This is, again, something that we put some research focus in, because I think as we get into these higher yield environments, we're at risk of giving up yield if we give up too early on the crop. So we looked at not just a standard R3 fungicide application with Preacts, which is a fungicide, and Fast-Tac, which is an insecticide. So that would be our standard recommendation would be at that R3 timing to manage late season diseases and insects. So we got a nice yield benefit out of that in our trial work. We duplicated or came back on top of those treatments with a later application this year, an R5 treatment, and it actually gave us even larger yield responses. And I think that was partially due to the late wet weather, as well as the late insect feeding. And it just highlights the fact that most of us have given up on the bean crop at R5. Those stresses that still come in that late can take away yield. And we've got to be aware of that, especially in years where we've got a lot of rain in August and some pretty high yield potential. Also pay attention to solar radiation. So when I think about Preacts applications, the fungicide piece of things, we also think about what is our solar radiation doing late in the year during R3 to R6. In 2018, it was decreasing. So we had plenty of cloudy days that came with the rainfall. Those cloudy days have the potential also to reduce seed weight. So less photosynthetic efficiency is the potential to have less seed weight on those beans. So we try to look for ways that we can influence photosynthetic activity on that crop. One of those ways, again, is with Preacts fungicide. So we have done some work where we've measured photosynthetic rate on beans, especially during cloudy conditions, and we see a pretty dramatic increase in photosynthetic rate. We did these measurements with a device called an ears meter that measures the photosynthetic rate. You see the untreated check and Preacts and the big increase in that photosynthetic rate that you got there. It directly correlated to a yield increase in these trials, and this was really absent of disease pressure. So we saw about an 8.7% increase in photosynthesis, 8.8% increase in yield. Again, that late cloudy conditions, lack of solar radiation can influence seed weight. It's another reason why we try to look at practices to help us keep that plant as efficient as possible. Preacts would be one of those practices. So I've just hammered through a whole lot of information in a relatively short period of time. We didn't cover everything that I normally would in a more lengthy presentation, but I just want to summarize a few of my final thoughts here and highlight the fact that if you're looking at trying to push the envelope in beans, you've got to understand that there are some risks associated to earn some of those big rewards. So some of the risks are, if you plant early and you get the beans out of the ground early and then we get a hard freeze, they may have to be replanted. We haven't seen that happen for several years, but it is a risk. Again, we've had March planting dates 3 years in a row that we've taken all the way to yield at our location. But depending on geographically where you are at, you have to understand that is a risk. The reward on the other side is the large yield increases that we've seen from the earlier planting dates. You got to think about strategies to maximize canopy photosynthesis, and you can look at it in a couple different ways. So you got agronomic practices like planting date that can move those flowering dates up earlier and allow you to take advantage of maximum light during early flower set as well as early pod set. So that's one strategy. You also need to think about things that you can try to do in season if the environment isn't going your way. If you're getting some cloudy days, lack of solar radiation, what things can I try to do to drive more photosynthesis? The soybean system is twofold. You need good agronomy on the front side. You need to think about the seeding rates, the planting dates, the seed treatments. You also have to think about crop management in season. And so it's not one or the other, it's both to get that really successful formula. So I challenge you to try to find those practices that consistently get you to a new yield plateau, and then stick to those practices. Don't look at trying to predict what practices are going to drive yield in each growing season. Get a system that you know can consistently make you better. And like any crop, we love to see 2018, where we get a lot of heat early and plentiful moisture through the year, and it drives record yields. That won't happen every year. So, 2019 is shaped up to maybe have a few more challenges starting out of the gate. We got to be prepared to make the adjustments needed to put ourselves in a position to be as successful as we can be, based upon what Mother Nature and what the environment gives us. So with that, I hope I've shared a few things that can be of use to you, a few things to try. I wish everybody the best of luck in 2019, and I'd like to at this point open it up for any questions.
Well, thank you, AJ. Yeah, we have a few questions submitted. First off, if you go to the 15-inch rows, what do you suggest for seed treatments? Do you suggest a fully treated bean?
Yeah, so even in a narrow row situation, I'll tell you that one of the challenges with narrow rows, especially if you get any sort of crusting happening early in the year, is you don't have as many friends to help push around you as you would in a 30-inch row. So that is one of the downsides of narrow rows. So I think it's even as much critical that you've got a seed treatment in narrow rows, maybe even more so than it would be in a wide row. So no doubt about it. In 15-inch rows, I would certainly focus on having a seed treatment there.
Sticking with the seed treatments, how much does seed treatment increase germination on an 80% germ?
So we've been looking, yeah, we've tried to look at a little bit of that. Seed quality is going to be down this year. I think anybody that saw what the beans that were coming into the tank this past fall look like probably realized that seed quality won't be as good as it maybe has been in previous years. What we've seen in some of our testing of treated and untreated seed, especially, you won't so much see it in the warm germ, but if you send in any samples and do accelerated aging or cold germ tests, you'll see about a 10 to 15% increase typically with a seed treatment in that scenario, and it's primarily going to help you with some of the specific seed-borne diseases like the diaporth species that we may have some potential to have there early in the year.
Great. So you presented a lot of information about the narrow row spacing versus the wider. If a 30-inch planter is what you have to work with, do you suggest checkboarding the field, cutting the population in half and covering the field twice, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at, obviously you got to look at the benefits on your operation. I mean, the first thing I would say is I would encourage taking a look at different options you've got. So it may be worthwhile to take a field and split, run a diamond, crisscross, or some sort of scenario to take a look at what narrow rows would do on your farm. That's one thing that I think is really important to actually regionally or put onto your farm yourself. I mean, me personally, yeah, I would look for any way to try to get narrow rows in my system. That's just me saying that from the yield side of things as well as weed control, there's benefits to doing it. I understand the efficiency side of things. So I totally understand 30-inch row planters, we can get more done. And so I get that. But again, I think it's just trying to do some things on your farm to understand what you're losing by not having those narrow rows.
Yeah. You presented a lot of research with 15 and 30-inch rows. Do you have any research with air seeders or any results with using an air seeder?
Yeah, so I've got, I guess, a love-hate relationship with air seeders. From a light interception standpoint, it's gonna put you in a better position because you've got 7.5-inch rows now, most likely. So you're going to do an even better job of intercepting light. That's the benefit you've got. On the downside, tends to be we tend to plant too many plants in that scenario to try to compensate for the lack of uniformity that you're going to get in seed placement. So what I have typically seen in our work is that it's going to kind of wash away the benefit of being in narrow rows because we aren't precision placing those seeds at the right depth and the same seed spacing. So what we have seen, I guess, bottom line is that the 15s, 20s, and the air seeded beans generally come out almost in a wash. And maybe even more frequently, the 15-inch rows, more precision planted, could be a little bit better, or 20s.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on variable rate seeding? Does it pay?
I've doing work on it. I mean, obviously the where we're located, our research farm, it's one soil type, and it's a very high yielding soil type. So the variable rate maybe doesn't make as much sense right here. Where my home farm is, we run a lot more variable soil types. I've been doing some work splitting some fields with variable rate programs versus a flat seeding rate. I believe that we're seeing some savings in seed cost, as well as maybe some minor benefits on the yield side. We're continuing to look at it. The way I'm putting those variable rate programs together are lower seeding rates in the higher yielding parts of the field, and in our soil types that the beans don't maybe grow as big and don't yield as much, we're increasing our seeding rates. So that's kind of the way that we're handling our variable rate program. Still a work in progress, I think, on the bean side, but I do believe there's going to be some validity to it.
Okay. This next question, they had a lot of soybean shattering this year. Is there anything specific that caused that? Are there genetic differences? What do you think? Do you know? Have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think some of the shattering issues were probably due to the number of drying and wetting events that we had. I mean, the environment was just so unique this year, and most everywhere that I have traveled this winter, that's been a topic of discussion. You just break down that pod wall when you wet and dry it multiple times, and with all the rain events we had, we did a lot of that. It makes it more susceptible to shatter. There probably were some varietal differences, but I think a lot of that was just environmentally driven.
Okay. What about seed spacing? Does this put more pods on?
You mean in regard? I guess is that I'm going to assume that's in regards to uniformity of seed spacing. Yeah. So I'll give you my thoughts. In a perfect world, you'd love to have every plant spaced uniformly. We know it's a benefit in corn. We'd love to see it in soybeans. I rank that as less important compared to having more seasonal light interception. So with soybeans, what we've seen is that uniformity of spacing and uniformity of emergence is not as important as it is in corn. Not downplaying the fact that it probably has still some importance, but the bigger piece is getting them out of the ground quicker. So hopefully maybe at some point we can figure out a way to get some precision planting, high germ seed that comes out of the ground uniformly on the April 15th planting dates. And I think we'll get yield benefit from that. But right now, earlier planting, bigger focus.
Okay. Got a fungicide question here. If you're dealing with white mold, do you recommend spraying fungicide at R3 and R5?
So if white mold is your driver, you're going to have a little different scenario. You're going to be an R1 application because that's typically when your white mold is going to be infecting. So you're going to be more in an R1 and an R3 program. So for the northern listeners that are standardly dealing with white mold and at risk for white mold infection, your program is going to change a little bit. And it doesn't downplay the fact that you still want to pay attention to what's happening in your beans at R5, but your disease management is going to be a little bit different with that particular disease.
Okay. What about planting in no-till environments? Do you have any thoughts to share there?
Yeah, so no-till, again, I come from an area where we do on our farm run some no-till acres. We increase our seeding rates about 10% in no-till. The other risk associated with no-till, so if you look at freeze points with soybeans, you're typically going to figure that if you're below 28 degrees for 4 hours, you're going to probably be at a death point for soybeans. If you're in the 29, 30 degree range, you're okay. But the issue in no-till is with all that residue, if your soybean plant is leaned up against residue, there's more risk for that plant being killed by a 29 degree frost versus a plant that's out in the open air with soil around it. So that's the risk, and is a little bit maybe higher in no-till. But again, that plant's actually got to be leaned up against some residue for that to happen. But we do make some slight adjustments on the seeding rate side in the no-till environments.
Great. What about with sulfur application? Have you tried that or had any results?
So there's some great data coming out of Purdue looking at sulfur early in the year. I will tell you that our experience has been probably traditionally more beneficial in lighter soil types, so lower CECs and coarser textured soils have been more beneficial to use sulfur. And I think sulfur acts a lot like nitrogen. It can be immobilized, and it's also mineralized through organic matter and residue. And I think that's probably why the lower CEC and lower organic matter soils have shown more benefit to sulfur. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2019. There's areas that didn't get as much tillage done as they wanted. There's been some late harvest. The residue hasn't had as much breakdown time. That could be an environment that we might see more sulfur immobilization in beans, and maybe some early applications be more of a factor this upcoming year. On our soil type, we've done some work right off the planter with sulfur, and the results have not been as consistent. We can get a half a bushel or a bushel occasionally, but we tend to mineralize a lot more sulfur on these soil types because they're heavier organic matter. So pay attention to your CECs, pay attention to your organic matter when thinking about sulfur.
Okay, got time for one more question. What haven't you tried that you think might bring about a soybean yield response, or that you want to try yet?
Yeah, good question. We've had plenty of frustrations, and I'll tell you that first. We've had things that we've done that we thought would be slam dunks that weren't. But one area that we're going to kind of hone in on this year. So I'll tell you one struggle that we've had is accessibility of nutrients in our soil type. And we've got good soil test levels, but we've also got high CECs. So it's been tough to unlock the nutrients when we want to. And I think in some of the record yields that we've seen previously, those tend to be lower CEC soils where nutrients become more available and are soaked up like an IV system. So one thing that we're going to try to look at for this year are some amendments in the soil to try to influence nutrient uptake. We're going to look at some humic and fulvic acids. We're going to look at carbon sources, some biological options to try to see if we can do a better job of unlocking nutrients. I think from a crop management side, we've got a pretty good system in place, and good agronomics with these early planting dates. But right now, we need to figure out how to access nutrients to support 120, 130 bushel beans, which is, you know, where we all, I think, would love to get to at some point.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time that we have today. We'll do our best. We have a few questions left to get those answered and posted with the recording on the website. You'll find this webinar and other soybean and agronomic resources on the Checkoff-funded website, ILSoy Advisor. And we thank you all for attending today and hope you have a great day.